Welcome to the channel, everybody. Today we are going to be looking at the LT50 command station from TCS. So back before I did my review on the CS105, I had mentioned that I had a little bit of an issue with it for a period of time. It turned out to be a cold solder joint that I ended up fixing. But that situation reminded me that the old adage, one is none, is definitely a thing. So I wanted to have a bit of a backup system just in case I ran into some issues going in the future. I want to try to keep my videos rolling out on a regular basis, and not having a command station is going to be a serious problem. So I do have an LNWI for my Digitrack system, but I really find it lacking when it comes to features. And so I thought, I do have a project coming up in the near future where I'm working on a collapsible switching layout to do some more locomotive testing on. And it would be nice to have a separate command station for that should I not want it connected directly to my current layout. And so what better time to pick up an LT50 than that situation? So I have been daily driving this unit for about a month now, and I definitely have some thoughts. So without adjusting too much of my current setup here, we have the LT50 sitting on my little cradle right here, and right here is my control panel. And it's pretty basic. It's just a fascia panel with two what I would call Ethernet or RJ45 connectors. Relatively simple to set up. On the back side, you have your pass-through for your LCC, as well as your track output, as well as a power input. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the system works. After messaging back and forth a little bit with the TCS support team, I got some of my questions answered, and I think it's important because as an N-scale guy, there are specific options within this that may or may not interest you, and so let's talk about that first. I picked up the CS105 because I was running into issues with my ESU cab control system as well as my ECOS. And I believe a lot of the issues I was having with those systems came down to either the voltage that they were outputting to the track or just the physical input voltage being too high. The NMRA does set some standards for this stuff, and do with that what you will, but I have just found better reliability with N-scale decoders running at or below 12 volts. So even when I run DC stuff, I tend to change the power supplies that come with a lot of those to be 12 volt, just so you can't full throttle it and potentially overvolt some of these decoders. They're supposed to be able to handle that, but anytime you introduce higher voltage into electronics, it generally means higher heat output. And with zero ventilation in a lot of these engines, that may have been what was causing some of my decoder failures. So for me personally, for my layout, I like to run 12 volt control systems through all of my locomotives. This particular unit comes with a 15 volt power supply. And I tried hooking it up to my 12 volt system, and it simply won't start the command station. Now, it can be used as a LCC access point with 12 volts being supplied to it, but it will not function as a actual command station. So I did some messing around. I am a bit of an electronics nerd, and I have a couple adjustable power supplies. So I went ahead, and if you provide it with at least 14.5 volts on startup, you can turn it down and actually run it at a lower voltage. It seems like the system's only looking for the proper voltage during startup. Now, that is not something that I would recommend doing. It was simply for testing purposes, and if I burned the $30, fascia panel board on this, that was a risk I was willing to take. But personally, I found that at those lower voltages, it worked just fine. You just have to be cognizant of the amount of power that you're pulling from the board. As many people may or may not know, as your voltage goes down, your amperage goes up to deliver the same amount of power. So if the board is only capable of handling 1.5 or so amps, you just kind of need to be cognizant of the amount of power you're pulling. I was just making sure I wasn't drawing too much. I just have a wall plug that tells me the power that the whatever's plugged into it is pulling, and I try to keep it under a certain level, and so far I haven't had any problems, and it does run quite a few N-scale locomotives in that setup. It's not what I would consider doing on a regular basis, having to turn up the voltage and then turn it down to a set point every time you start this up. It's really inconvenient. So for N scale guys, this may not be what you want to do if you are worried about input voltages like I am. This may be more of an HO scale specific type thing. However, according to NMRA data sheets or what have you, technically all N scale locomotives should run on this. I'm just being a little more careful. The other thing I've been using it for, and you can just plug this into the CS105, is just as an access point. So you can run this as a wired throttle in any position or any position on your LLC, I should say, as long as you're not plugged into the LT port on the front of the fascia panel. There are two ports. The left one is the LT port, and that is what makes this essentially act as a command station. And then if you plug into the right side port, which is your LCC, it just acts as another throttle on the LCC network for your command station that you're plugged into. So a couple of things to note when it comes to power delivery of this unit. I did run multiple locomotives with it in my own special testing parameters. Like I said, I turned the voltage down, and it handled 5 or 6 locomotives, no problem. So inside of N scale, this should have no problem running a small layout, even a medium-sized layout. The one little weird thing that I ran into is if you are using this as a wired throttle as well with an existing LCC system, it has to be powered, or the panel has to be powered every time you start it up. From the data sheets I was reading from TCS, I believe that this can be strictly powered by your LCC bus. And maybe I have my jumpers in the wrong configuration, but it will stay powered if I leave it connected and my CS105 running. If I turn off my 12 volt power supply for the rest of my layout, and that's what I'm using to run it right now. But if I turn that off, turn off my CS105 and start it back up, it's not powered directly off of the LCC bus. So it needs the power, at least the way I have it set up currently, to turn on the system. Once it's on and the LCC bus communicates with it and essentially says, hey, there's an ECU connected right here, what have you, it stays powered at that point. Not sure if that's a firmware problem or what's up. Maybe I have my jumpers in the wrong place, but a little odd that it won't just function off of the LCC power all the time. So side by side with the UTW-50 and the LT-50, they're basically the same throttle. The only difference is this thing weighs nothing because there's no battery installed, as well as no Wi-Fi capability. So I'm sure there's some circuitry inside of this that changes that up. And then on the bottom, you have your Ethernet connection port. Basically, these function exactly the same as one another, other than this is an encoder throttle where this is my potentiometer throttle. Personally, I think this was the biggest mistake that TCS could have made putting this together. I really wish they would have went with the potentiometer inside of this as a dedicated yard switching throttle. This would be amazing. You just have a fascia panel right next to your yard, plug this in, it's instantaneously turned on, and it could work as your yard switching throttle. That would be my primary use for this if I was going to have this as a secondary option on a bigger layout. I think that would have been what this would work best for. So this is basically exactly the same as the UWT-50 with the encoder installed. So I do find yard mode to be a little less usable with this model. You have to use your side control buttons, and that's really not my jam, as well as the switch in the center button. I would much rather have this as the potentiometer so I could use this in my yard all the time. However, as a basic throttle, it does everything you need it to do. I have a very large roster. I didn't actually try importing all of those locomotives. I understand it's right about 25 units. For the average guy, I think that's more than enough. And I'm really not into the whole roster thing. Some people get really into this. I need it named, BNSF 2145 or what have you. I just generally run with the road number. It's easy enough to figure it out. I only have a couple in my roster that are actually duplicates. And frankly, if you put, let's say 504, because that's one off the top of my head, I have my Amtrak 504 SP40. and my U23B 504 that I run as my yard switcher, they still are attached to the same address, so you got to be careful with which one you select anyway. So I prefer just running road number as my roster. I don't do anything extra. So for the average user, more than enough. I think it's plenty powerful enough to get that done. One thing that I got wrong in my review of the CS105 is the interface. And I swear this worked before. Not totally sure what was going on there, but the throttles function a little bit different on LNWI versus LCC. And I actually stated this as a plus when it came to the lighting controls. And so something that I should probably go back and make an edit to, and I just haven't done yet. When you are on the LNWI, so like a Y throttle or what have you, the interface allows you to intersect and cut off certain functions before sending that out to your locomotive. So for lighting functions, for example, I had mentioned that it was really powerful because you could change what functions were going to other locomotives in your consist, and it allowed you a whole lot of control over your lead engine versus the rest of your consist. So lighting controls, sound functionality, things like that. This only has the basics, as well as all of my other throttles connect to the CS105. If you want to change what functions go out to, say, other locomotives in your consist, like for me, I use function 7 as my ditch light control. If I don't want that going out to the other locomotives in my consist, I have to physically select each other locomotive in my consist and change how they behave inside that consist. And that's a little less powerful than just the overall settings that I can make inside the LNWI. And this falls short in that way too. Every locomotive that you put in your consist, you have to change your lighting functionality separately or your function functionality separately. So lead loco has headlight and bell and horn that only go to it. Every other function goes out to every other unit inside of your consist, right? So for me, most of my units that have ditch lights are running ESU decoders because it's a separate function. I just do an if-then statement inside of my decoder so that unless it has certain other functions active like the headlight, those other functions will not work. So it just makes it default that way inside of consist. But no, that added functionality that I was talking about for the other throttles only works in a Y throttle type setup or LNWI. Directly connected to the LCC, as of currently, there is some sort of hardware limitation that TCS described to me. So hopefully maybe in the future they can fix that. A global level capability to run your lighting controls and function controls inside of consist through your command station would be a huge bonus and will push this into God tier status, in my opinion. So the one thing I do want to say, when connected to the LCC bus versus the command station bus, this has a little more lag than my wireless controllers do. So one thing that I really liked about my wireless controllers is that they were near instantaneous. And I said that was one of the pluses of having them. I've tried other wireless systems and there's a bit of a downtime. This suffers from that, unfortunately. When it is strictly the command station, instantaneous controls. When it is going through the LCC bus, there's just a little bit of lag. And I don't know if you can hear this because I'm mic'd up here, but there's about a half a second there, hard to perceive, but it's not quite perfect. And what it comes down to is when you're switching with this, that half a second or so makes it a little tough to do really scale approaches into things. So you kind of have to time that a little better than you would with, say, the wired control or the wireless controllers. Again, UWT-50 with the potentiometer is like the premier switching throttle. There's nothing else on the market that's better than that. But it definitely has a better lag time compared to this. So something else that's really nice about this is its startup time. Now you get used to the wireless system. They're relatively quick to start, but you want to come over, do some switching, or you just need to make some quick adjustments to a consist you got running or something of that nature. It's really convenient to have this in the off position and just plug it in, and there we are up and running. That only took a couple of seconds. That's super convenient, and I really like it. Again, a bit of a fail. If this was the potentiometer version, this would be excellent for having right next to a switching yard. You could just jump to wherever you wanted to work, plug it in, and you're up and running in seconds. So honestly, wish this was the potentiometer version. So when it comes to actually using this, it functions just like the encoder version UWT-50. And so if you're curious how this works, I'm going to refer you back to my CS105 ecosystem review or my first look. I do a lot of actual use of these controllers in those videos, and I think they show a really good use case for every particular application, and so I'll send you there for that. But if I was a beginner and needing an affordable command station, why would I choose this over something else? And I think that is the question that we really need to talk about. So the question now becomes, who is this for? This is obviously priced to be an entry level into the hobby, and I think it's actually a pretty good price point that they're bringing this in at. And the availability of fascia panels that are really cheap, like $30 a piece, as secondary access points for this is interesting. And maybe someday they will start selling these controllers separate at a slightly cheaper price, say the $150 range. And you do have a pretty interesting price point there that you're coming in at for an existing system. But N-scalers are in a little bit different market than, say, everybody else. This can produce about 1.5 amps of power at about $200. Meanwhile, we have the ability to use like a Raspberry Pi type setup if you're capable of doing a little bit of programming for about half of that. And there are actually going to be some factory solutions that are providing something that is built off of that architecture. And at that, you could start using a phone or a computer interface, and you could definitely start a railroad for a very cheap price. And I know there are channels out there dedicated to doing that. Jimmy over at Coffee and Trains, like that's how he got started. He's a cool guy, has lots of cool videos about this. Matter of fact, maybe I even watched his video back in the day when I set up my Raspberry Pi to be my computer interface for programming via JMRI. It's a very cheap option. And so we're competing directly with that. Now, as a just point and click solution, right? Awesome for that. But I feel that the voltage on this is just too high, at least for me, to recommend. I have just found in my personal testing that lower voltage is better for N-scale. I have many less decoder failures if I'm staying under that 12 volt threshold. So I wish they had an option. And again, they stated they're trying to do this to be inside of NMR specs that would work for both HO and N-scale. But for me, I just can't recommend it for that. I just feel it would be better if you could run this off of a 12 volt system. Maybe in the future, they'll provide a facial panel that you could buy that would run on 12 volts, in which case that might be an interesting thing. You're also limiting yourself if you're ever going to grow into something bigger. So I spoke to them about potentially adding the 106, and I forget, I want to say CS106, but it's actually, I think it's the B106, their booster. And theoretically, you could have this as your primary throttle, hook it up to the booster through the LCC bus, and if they were both running the 15 volt power supply, you could connect it up and run it no problem, and that would allow you a whole lot of extra power for, say, an HO layout. Not something you'd necessarily need for a small N-scale layout. If you start getting over a certain size, having wireless throttle is probably going to be a necessity at some point. So looking at the CS105 is probably a better long-term solution. So the upgrade path is difficult. You could still use this, and I do on my 105, but it's just not as powerful as the potentiometer version. If they would have done that, it would have been a more usable use case. Could have seen a very viable upgrade path. Now, if you were using this strictly as a command station, so say for example, you use the fascia board and connect it up to the LT50 as, say, a command station, disconnect it from the main. So you're not actually connected up to any of your track work. And then have that run through your LCC network over to the B106 that was running on the 12-volt power supply and had it supplying your rails. That's possibly a more viable option. You're looking at roughly $200 for this setup, and $200 to $250 kind of depending on where you're getting stuff from for the B106. And now you're coming in at kind of the same price point as, say, an NCE power cab with the same amount of power. And that's a pretty viable option. You can get a lot of locomotives running on that. You could potentially get another throttle that's relatively cheap, $150 to $200. Maybe they'll start supplying these things separately. Or you could buy them with strictly the addition panel. So instead of the fascia panel that has the LT bus and the LCC bus, it has both LCC expansion bus ports. That could be a viable option in the near future. And for guys that strictly want to be wired, don't want to mess with Wi-Fi, that could be a cheaper option than running the CS105. You still run into a bit of an issue if you disconnect your throttle from the LT port. It will stop running a locomotive that you currently have pulled up and shut down the entire LCC bus. So there is some usability problems when you run into that. So for N scale, this is probably not going to be your jam unless you're okay running that higher voltage. Now for you HO guys that lurk on my channel, it is actually a pretty viable option for you. That higher voltage isn't going to bother most HO locomotives. They can just handle it better. And you can actually do some pretty decent sized stuff with about 1.5 amps. That's like 3 or 4 locomotives. It's been a while since I never ran HO on DCC, but I think you could probably do, quite a few locomotives on 1.5 amps without needing a booster. And so a decent sized switching layout could pretty easily be run with one of these. I think that's a pretty viable solution. And for $200 as an all-in-one setup that could do that, that's actually a pretty good price point. And I think that's really where they're going to shine trying to sell this product. So for me, in N scale, probably a pass. But for you HO guys, this is a pretty viable solution, and I would say go for it. There's a good upgrade path when it comes to running this on HO. So that is kind of my thoughts and feelings on this. Again, if you want to check out how it actually runs, just refer to the encoder version of my wireless throttle stuff that I put out there. I walk you through how to do everything, run some units, show you yard mode, all that fun stuff. This has all the same functionality. So rock and roll, everybody. Have a good week now.